Drew, the team of the week. I'm going to start with the Oregon Ducks' big win over Utah. Utah have been playing everybody well this season. That's a tough team to beat in Salt Lake City. They beat the Utes 35-6 behind Bo Nix. A very efficient day from him. Ryan McGrady, give us a little context on this game, please.
Yeah, you mentioned tough to beat Utah and Salt Lake City, and Oregon goes in there and uh, has a 35-6 beatdown to snap the Utes' 18-game home win streak. Oregon becomes the first team to win at Utah with fans in attendance since USC in 2020, a span of 28 games, and they're being led by Bo Nix, who leads FBS with a 78.3 completion percentage this season. He's the third player joining Joe Burrow and Colt McCoy since 2000 to complete 78% of his passes through the first eight games of the season.
I don't think people really understand how well Bo Nix is playing. The other thing about this is Kenny Dillingham, the offensive coordinator last year, gets hired by Arizona State, the head coach there. Oregon brings in Will Stein, and it seems like Oregon just hasn't missed a beat. Drew, how about this? I know you're into the Heisman odds. Last week, I couldn't believe my eyes. I could be wrong here. McGrady, I'm going to need a fact check from you on this. Bo Nix was plus 2,000, and then after this game against Utah, he shoots up to plus 400. He's number 4 in the Heisman race, according to Vegas right now. 8 straight games over 70% completion. Threw for 248 yards, 2 touchdowns. Troy Franklin did his thing as well. Drew, the final 4 games for Oregon, 3 out of the 4 at home. You got Cal, USC, and Oregon State at home. Only 1 road game over the next 4 at Arizona State. Drew, I think this is one of the most dangerous teams in football. I know this is a recruiting podcast, and we're going to talk a little bit about what Oregon's doing on the recruiting trail as well, especially on the defensive line. Dude, I just feel like this time of year, it's all about who's playing the best ball. I kind of got Oregon circled right now. I would not be shocked if they end up getting into the college football playoff.
Well, you want to talk about Bo Nix, and rightfully so, but what about just Oregon at the point of attack? And last week I came on here, Utah, Kyle Whittingham, my team of the week. This is the second week in a row that team has then lost the following week with Utah going down to Oregon. It was North Carolina the week before, losing to Virginia after they beat Miami. I'm just impressed with what Dan Lanning, the Danimal, has done in the trenches on both sides of the ball. It feels like an SEC front. I know Oregon is moving to the Big Ten, but you got to think this unit's going to be able to match up physically with future opponents. And I'm talking over the next few years. Kyle Whittingham said it, quote unquote, we very rarely get out physicaled, but today we got out physicaled on the line of scrimmage. If you had to see what the biggest single problem in the entire game was, that was it. I've been impressed. And I know you mentioned Elijah Rushing, 5-star defensive lineman. He ends up committing to Oregon on Monday. You've teased it in the past. The Ducks have one of the top defensive line classes in the country. When's the last time we talked about a team on the West Coast having that? But really, the top 4 commits for Oregon in this 2024 cycle are all point of attack, physical type of guys. Aiden Breeden, Elijah Rushing, Braden Platt, and then Jaquan McRoy, who's a mammoth of a human out of the state of Alabama. Coop, I mean, you want to talk about Oregon? I think go back to the season opener last year. They got boat raced by Georgia in Atlanta to open up this season. Be interesting if those two teams lined it up right now, because I don't think that gap is as big as it once was. And Dan Lanning has done an excellent job of turning things around and getting adjusted quickly.
That game feels like 10 years ago, and I'm with you. I think Oregon could line up against UGA right now, and that would be a close game. I think that would probably Georgia maybe favored by a touchdown in that game, less than 1 possession. Drew, the other thing about this and the finality here, what I want to end on, you talk about Utah, that rushing attack. They finished with 5 rushing first downs. 4 of those came in the last 2 drives for Utah. So you want to talk about point of attack play for Oregon. Oregon being able to establish the line of scrimmage against, let's face it, right, the bully of that league the last 2 years in Utah. You got to go through them. Oregon did that in Salt Lake City, a big feat for them. Elijah Rushing, number 2 edge in the country, commits to Oregon, formerly committed to Arizona. Oregon moves up from 11th to 6th in the 2024 class rankings, would be the highest finish since being 6th in 2021. Second highest rated class in the Big Ten behind Ohio State. If you put them there today, it also gives Oregon 11 top 247 commitments. I love that stat in 2024. 24 and Dan Lanning's last two classes. Drew, we kind of talked about it yesterday on the recruiting show at 24/7 Sports. Oregon feels like the only team of the newcomers in the Big Ten from the Pac-12 footprint, right? So when you consider that USC, UCLA, and Washington being the others, they seem like the one that, okay, these guys are built for the Big Ten. But with the 12-team college football playoff also arriving in 2024, they seem like they're built nationally as well. Like we talked about Oregon potentially going up against Georgia just a year later from where they started with Dan Lanning era. They look like a team that's not going anywhere for a long time. And the reason I say that is because of the way that they're building it up front. And you think about guys like Mateo Yu, who has played well, Tatum Tuioti, and then you add in guys like Aiden Breland, Elijah Rushing. Who else is doing that on the West Coast? And that's a rhetorical question because no one else is.
Yeah, I agree. I think the biggest question for Oregon moving forward is, what's the plan at quarterback post Bo Nix? And I'm sure they're going to be, if they want to be active in the transfer portal, they're going to be an attractive destination. And that's because when you look at the two deep, Cooper, it is built for success and success at the highest level. We just mentioned it earlier on the podcast. I mean, if you line up Oregon and Georgia right now, what is the spread for that game? And I think a little over a year and a half ago when they opened up the season against each other, you would have said, whatever it was, 3 touchdowns or so. I think Oregon is impressive. Elijah Rushing, to me, is a guy that's probably going to need some time before he's ready to go. But why can't you use him as a situational rusher early on in certain exotic packages? I like just in general the collection of talent they have assembled on that defensive side of the ball. Guys that can do a little bit of everything. And it starts in the secondary. I think it's going to be hard to score on Oregon if they can keep this defensive staff in place and these guys can keep progressing. So absolutely huge pickup for Oregon. Interested and excited to see how this defensive line unit's going to finish out. But Elijah Rushing, I mean, arrows pointing up. We've struggled to kind of find a player comparison for him. Coop, do you have one? It seems like anytime anyone's over 6'5" these days, Greg Russo's the kind of the go-to, the former Miami pass rusher who's now with the Buffalo Bills. I'm just not sure. Does he remind you of anyone?
Yeah, that's a good one. You see Eric Armstead on the screen right there in terms of the pro comparison. I said yesterday he's a puppy. He's got a 6'8" wingspan. He's got long arms. He's still growing, Drew. And I think the thing is, his game is starting to reflect where he is in his development. But overall, I mean, you don't know where this guy's going to play. I think he's athletic enough to play on the edge. He can also grow into 280 pounds, potentially play inside at the next level. So I think everything's out in front of him. I think the physical development, the technical development as well. He's only scratching the surface of what he's going to be at a player. And I think he's one of those guys, Drew, that are kind of rare inside the top 16. So the top half of the top 32 when you're talking about these 5 stars, right? Where it's like, listen, their best football is still ahead of them. So the nutritional program, the strength conditioning program, the coaching, the player development part is all going to be really key for Elijah Rushing. I think he is a clay that needs to be molded. Fortunately, he's going to a spot with Dan Lanning, Tosh Lupoy, that know a thing or two. In terms of a name that comes to mind, I don't really have one. I was thinking about that yesterday. I think for Oregon fans, you probably think of those two guys in Armstead and Buckner, right, who have been there in the past, both kind of 6'6" linemen that can give you some inside-out ability.
Yeah, it's just funny. I mean, you could kind of say the same stuff about L.J. McCray, right? Our guy we moved into the top 10 who's now headed to Florida. I mean, these are whatever you want them to be, just really going to depend on getting them in the strength program, how they physically develop, and what kind of scheme you want to use them. And I think that's what makes them unique, is just that versatility and the ability to do different things.
Drew, you talked about quarterback, and I'm just putting that out there a little bit. Ethan Garbers has been the quarterback for UCLA, getting the run over the last couple of weeks. It was the Dante Moore show earlier in the season. I'm not saying it, but I am putting it out there. Is there a chance you think that maybe Dante Moore goes sniffing around and maybe says, you know what, Oregon looks pretty good right now. I think they need a guy post Bo Nix.
I mean, that would quite be quite the full circle, right? It'd be like a year later. Yeah, circle of life. I mean, who knows?
Right. you are watching and tuning in to the 24/7 Sports Football Recruiting Podcast with Andrew Ivins and Cooper Petagna every Tuesday and Wednesday at 5 o'clock Eastern Time. You can also find us on the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel.